Lady Bottomley, I'm going to move on to some questions about specific documents and specific issues that arose firstly during your time as Minister of State and then as Secretary of State. Before I turn to those documents, it's right, isn't it, that you say in your statement that your independent recollection of events is now very limited and you're heavily reliant on the documents that I'm going to show you?
I remember almost nothing. I remember the people, but the documents I do not remember, I'm afraid.
Let's begin with the increases in funding to the Macfarlane Trust in the autumn of 1989, at a time when you were Minister of State, shortly after you had been appointed as Minister of State on the 28th of October. Could we have on screen, please, DHSC 302536_078. And this is a minute that we looked at with Mr. Mellor, and it's from Mr. Dobson, a senior official within the Department of Health, sent to Mr. Davey, the Private Secretary to the Minister of State for Health. And it's dated the 26th of October, 1989, so 2 days before you were appointed in Mr. Mellor's place. Mr. Mellor's evidence was to the effect that while this document and the submission had been produced in response to urgings that he had put forward, he thinks it's unlikely that he would have, well, certainly he wouldn't have been able to take a considered view on these matters because he was moved on and you came into place. There was a paper that was produced to go, for which this is the covering minutes, which has been provided to you, which set out a number of options for what to do about the HIV litigation. An out-of-court settlement, an increase to the Macfarlane Trust, ex gratia payments, a commission of inquiry, and then the general option of responding with more of a public statement about what the department's position was. The minute summarises the position in this way. It says, your minute of the 11th of October to Mr. Heppel asked for advice on various aspects of the current litigation of a related Sunday Times campaign. I attach a paper which has been prepared in consultation with medical and legal colleagues within Medicines Division and with Finance. Part 1 reviews the current position both on the litigation and on the Macfarlane Trust. Part 2 considers a number of options for making more money available to the haemophiliacs. None of them are without difficulty. The cheaper ones are unlikely to buy much peace, and the more expensive ones run a severe risk of knock-on effects, e.g. on other litigation against the licensing authority, or of setting a precedent which would encourage other victims of medical accidents. And it is likely that the Treasury would resist any, emphasis on the original, any additional expenditure, so long as counsel advises that we have a good chance of winning the case. Our advice therefore remains that ministers should continue with the litigation and should not signal any readiness to provide additional funding beyond the steps already in hand to allow greater flexibility to the Trust and a veiled promise to consider topping it up when it is needed. Ministers are also invited to consider the possibility of responding to the more inaccurate newspaper comments, so far as this is possible or advisable, now that the case is before the courts. And then it refers to some specific points which are addressed. First of all, do you think it is likely that you would have seen this minute and the documents that went with it when you came into office a couple of days later?
I do not think I saw this minute at all. I came into office at a time of a rather sudden reshuffle in any event, and I was thrown into the hurly-burly of immediate action and demands. And I think they would have waited for me to meet the relevant team of officials and go through particular policies and developments.
Does that perhaps reflect a difficulty in government that one Minister of State has pushed for options to be presented? That Minister of State then gets moved and the options paper doesn't get put in front of his successor?
Well, I think I heard Mr. Mellor say, and I would agree, that his private secretary and my private secretary was an excellent man called Alan Davey, who now runs Radio 3. And I absolutely trusted Alan Davey to tell me what I needed to know and needed to hear. But it may be that this wasn't an immediate issue. It's a very important issue, but there were probably more immediate crisis issues to be addressed. And I think my statement suggests I then met the AIDS team and various others. So although this is extremely important, I suspect it was picked up in the briefings over the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Mr. Davey would have remained in place, so he would have formed the institutional memory on this point.
Precisely. I had 4 or 5 private secretaries, top quality, and I kept in touch with them. And my criteria of a private secretary was I wanted somebody who wasn't afraid of me, somebody who would not be afraid to say, this is what you need to do, this is what you need to look at, and somebody who wanted to do good. Some people are quite cynical in the political world, whereas I liked having a team that actually wanted to do the right thing.
Would you expect the private secretary to be offering advice on policy?
He would not offer advice on policy, but in a Sir Humphrey way, he might well have a view and say, your predecessor thought A, B, C, you might want to consider it.
Would you agree that the position reached by Mr. Dobson at the time of this minute is to hold the then current line, continue the litigation, and no additional funding to the Macfarlane Trust beyond that which was already in the motions of which are being put in place?
I would.
Let's turn then to DHSC 304415_156. This is a minute from Strawn Heppel, who you have referred to earlier, and again somebody for whom you express respect and regard. And it's sent to the Private Secretary of the Secretary of State, Mr. McEwen, but also copied to Mr. Davey and a number of others on the list, the other ministers, the special advisor within the Department of Health, the Permanent Secretary's private office, and the CMO's private office. And what Strawn Heppel wrote in this minute is this. This is a short note designed to act as an agenda for tomorrow morning's meeting with the Secretary of State. It reflects discussions between the Minister of State for Health, that's you, and myself in the light of our meeting this afternoon with Mr. Robert Keyes MP. I think that should be Mr. Robert Key, singular, who is also a Vice President of the Haemophilia Society. The Minister of State for Health's aim is to identify proposals which A, sufficiently meet the aspirations of the Haemophilia Society so that they are prepared to recommend their members not to proceed with legal action, B, are accepted by the public and, if possible, the campaigners as being an adequate response to the situation of haemophiliacs with AIDS/HIV, C, do not set any unacceptable precedents for the future, e.g. by implying NHS liability for treatment which reflects the best available medical information at the time, but turns out later to be wrong, or accepting a duty of care for the approval of a particular new drug. On this basis, the following proposals might fit the bill. First, increasing the Macfarlane Trust funds by 2.5 or 3 times to 25 or 30 million over the next 3 to 4 years, say another 5 million this year and 5 million in each of the next 2 or 3 years. This would give each family roughly £25,000, about the average German and Danish figure. Mr. Key thinks this might be enough, although he thinks £40 to £50 million has a better chance of success, and starting off thinking in terms of 100 million. The Society would like to settle out of court for £75,000 a family, he said. Second, quantifying and making public, possibly through a parliamentary question from Mr. Key, the average value per family of social support on top of any help from the Macfarlane Trust. This would cover social security and social services, but probably not healthcare. Third, explaining to the Haemophilia Society, as we've already done to Mr. Key, the strain that a court case is bound to put on the families concerned, and that the government cannot give way on the principle of liability. On the finance front, A, there is no obvious money in our kitty for this year, except about £350,000 in the AIDS kitty, but we will need to go through the budgets in more detail. B, Treasury are likely to resist to any further claim on the contingency reserve. The original £10 million came from the reserve. C, we could find the money in future years by top-slicing the HCHS programme, but of course top-slicing is never popular with the service. Timing is of the essence. There is an adjournment debate, Mr. Patrick Cormack, next Monday, and the judge is seeing the families, Mr. Key says, on the 6th of December for a first hearing. So that is what Mr. Heppel wrote in that minute. Mr. Key was the Conservative MP for Salisbury and somebody you describe in your statement as a respected colleague.
Good man.
You must have been briefed on this issue prior to your meeting with Mr. Key, and obviously you had asked for something to be produced as a result of your conversation with Mr. Heppel. Is this minute the kind of thing that you would expect to come out of such a conversation?
I think it's clearly put. Other officials would have made it more rambling, but I think it's clear and coherent. And I respected the advice being given.
So it seems then that you, within a week or so of being within the Department of Health, had decided that you did want to seek to try to do something to meet the HIV litigation. And you had set out your 3 aims there, and Mr. Heppel had then gone away and produced what he thought might fit the bill.
I think the aims might have been part of a dialogue with Mr. Heppel, and of course they are very tricky aims, that we want to give enough to prevent the litigation going ahead, because I was very aware that these were people who, with very limited life expectancy, people were dying already, and to go through a court case is wretched and miserable. So I was very aware of that. I was aware of the public opinion, but frankly, I mind less about public opinion than a lot of politicians, because so I am. But I was very worried about the precedent. I really did understand this problem that the NHS is trying to do something unique. We're trying to give everybody everything forever for free. No other country in the world does that. We were terribly worried about the litigation taking place in the US, and that the whole of the budget could be taken up with litigation, and the whole that defensive medicine, maybe I'm skipping ahead a bit, but this was in my mind even then, that this really was a difficult area. But if we could find a way to address those 3 objectives, that would be excellent. And I think later there's a minute me saying, Mrs. Bottomley thinks we should do more, which I did.
We'll come on to that minute in a second, but just on this point about the dangers of a precedent, was that something that you were advised about by the civil servants as well?
I'm sure it was. But I think I had sufficient awareness of the way the NHS work, the way medical practitioners work, already to have an understanding that it sounds wonderful, but in practice, it can become really sinister. And for a limited amount of resource, you want to give the maximum amount into improving patient care. And no-fault compensation, which it would have led to, inevitably leads to a diversion of a limited budget away from direct patient care.
The proposal that Mr. Heppel put forward there was to increase the funding to the Macfarlane Trust by something in the region of 15 to 20 million pounds over a number of years. So would you agree that the position had therefore moved on from the one that was expressed by Mr. Dobson in his minute of the 26th of October 1989?
Well, throughout this, it's clear that there was a great deal of trust and respect, as far as I understand it, between officials and the Macfarlane Trust and the Haemophilia Society. It's really characterised by the sort of mutual respect and the number of occasions where praise is given either way for the work and the degree to which they've inspired confidence on each side. So whatever the minutes are, I always assumed there was ongoing dialogue in the background. And we wanted to get this settled. I wanted to get this settled. And so I was pleased to see there'd been an improvement in the availability of resource.
You mentioned the significance of the Haemophilia Society there. The first of the objectives set out at paragraph 2 of Mr. Hebble's minute. We could have page 1 of that back on screen, please. Was that any proposal should be sufficient to meet the aspirations of the Haemophilia Society so that they are prepared to recommend their members not to proceed with the legal action. Did you expect the legal action to be dropped if the Haemophilia Society took the view that they weren't going to recommend that their members sign up?
I had no view on that. These were early days in my experience. I believe Robert Key hoped that might be the case, and I would have wished it to be the case because I take the view that most legal action ends in tears and is extremely distressing for all concerned.
The second goal...
I was hopeful, but these are goals which are quite difficult to accomplish all three.
Yes. The second one, accepted by the public and, if possible, the campaigners. The distinction there between seeking to find something that was acceptable to the public and, if possible, also being acceptable to the campaigners. Is that a tacit recognition that it would be very difficult to find something that was acceptable to the campaigners?
Well, if you're in politics, you know that campaigners tend to move from one subject to another. Campaigners change the world, but they don't very often say, well, that's absolutely great. They're more likely to say, well, that's good, but let's go a bit further. I mean, that's the way of the world. But they achieve change, and they did achieve change in this regard.
The figure of 15 to 20 million pounds, sorry, I should just say we've discussed the third of those goals about avoiding a precedent. I would also note that you discussed that further at paragraph 4.26 and a number of other places in your statement as well. But the figure of an additional 15 to 20 million pounds, was that based upon any particular assessment of the needs of people with haemophilia?
Not as far as I knew. It may have been, it may not have been, but I wasn't appraised of the basis of the figure.
It's certainly nothing in the statement suggests, in the minutes suggests that this is a figure which has been developed in order to meet a particular set of needs, is there?
But this is one document when no doubt there was a paper mountain behind it. I mean, civil servants love sending each other missives, and what the background was, I really don't know. But I'm sure there had been informal discussions between the Macfarlane Trust, Haemophilia Society and officials.
In terms of the financing of this, there was a reference to top slicing the HCHS programme. Could you just translate that?
That's the hospital and community services budget. So this is where the money is going into the community very often for maybe district nurses, health centres, really important work, not glamorous work. So the problem of health spending is people want to give the money to the great cathedrals, the great important hospitals. But the real work, of course, in health and prevention is so often in the community. And it's not the glamorous side of it, but it's the essential side of it. And when we really wanted to spread out our work for anybody and everybody who was HIV positive or had AIDS or involved in the prevention work, that's exactly the sort of budget that would have been raided. So you can get away with it because it's not so obvious, but it's the wrong thing to do.
Top slicing means taking a certain amount away from the future budget, is that right?
Yes. Ken Clarke had a very strong view about devolving as much money as possible to the regions for them to make their decisions as closely as possible to the patients who are being treated. politicians love keeping packets of money in the centre so they can make a statement saying, I've announced 40 million, I've announced 20 million, But I was convinced by Ken Clarke, rather, I think, principled position, that actually sending it to the regions to set their priorities in the local context was the right thing to do. Now, there were particular times when money was ring-fenced, and that was for new services. So for HIV/AIDS, because nothing had existed in the past, that money was ring-fenced to try to ensure that services developed. But for the generality, it would be out for local people to set their priorities.
What is being discussed here, then, is not sending as much money to the regions in order to pay for this centrally funded project. And I think Mr. Heppel notes, perhaps for obvious reasons, that is something which is never popular.
Can you move very kindly move the slide on a bit?
If we go to paragraph 4
yes.
On the next page, this is where it's discussed.
Yes, sorry, it's not quite right even now for me. Yeah, got it, thank you.
This is the third bullet point there. We can find the money in future years by top slicing the HCHS programme, but of course top slicing is never popular with the service.
Exactly.
There are further minutes which you refer to at paragraph 4.8 in your witness statement, which I'm not going to go to, but you, to summarise them, the minutes indicate that the plaintiff's lawyers were looking for a much higher sum to end the litigation, and a figure of £86 million was the one eventually alighted upon. Obviously much higher than the 15 to 20 million pounds being discussed here, and indeed higher than Mr. Key's suggestion of 40 to 50 million pounds. Was any consideration given at that time to settling at a much higher figure, much closer to the plaintiff's sum?
Not that I know of. You've heard it fair and square from Mr. Heppel. There is no obvious money in our kitty. And so I don't believe that was the case.
Was there also an expectation that the Treasury would not be willing to dip into the reserve?
The general view of ministers like myself is that anybody in the Treasury is a brute, and they have malign intent, and their life is to make things as difficult as they can. Now, of course, this is not true, and you had a most elegant exposition from John Major and David Mellor about what charming people they are in the Treasury, and he didn't want to be an abominable no-man. But from my point of view, the Treasury weren't to be trusted for a moment, and my whole life was spent engaged in armed combat, trying to win my budget and fight to the bitter end. And there's quite a funny comment later on in, I think, one of Ken Clarke's books that says, I always held out to the bitter end. It went through to EDX, and in the end, they gave me another 100 million or something. But all of my life was spent waiting for the public expenditure round and fighting the case of health, because there were so many things we needed to do and wanted to do. But I was too passionate about it. I left it to sort of wiser, cooler heads than mine to actually do the negotiation on these points of detail.
Let's turn to a Treasury document then from around this time, HMTR 601_005. This is dated the 13th of November, and it's sent from Mr. Saunders to the Principal Private Secretary of the Chancellor, John Major, at the time. A document I think that we looked at yesterday. This was provided because a line to take had been requested by the Chancellor in respect of the autumn statement on haemophiliacs and AIDS. If we could turn to the second page, please. Paragraphs 5 and 6. And this is the section that is not for use, but is for the background information for Minister, and I'll read through. It's, what was written is this. I understand that Mr. Clarke will be considering the matter at an internal meeting tomorrow. He is said to be sceptical about the need for any further payment. The Trust still has £8 million in the kitty. But Mrs. Bottomley is said to think that the government must be seen to be doing more. The outcome is likely to be a further payment of perhaps £5 million to the Trust next year, to be found from within the agreed provision for 1990 to 1991. An out-of-court settlement would be quite a different matter. Although the Department of Health could probably settle more cheaply than if they were to lose the case, the cost would still be at least 100 to 200 million. The legal advice is in any case that the NHS is not liable, and the action for compensation is unlikely to be successful. An out-of-court settlement would also raise the prospect of no-fault compensation generally for victims of medical accidents, which could be very expensive indeed, and raise difficult questions about why, if liability is not admitted, this group of AIDS victims deserves compensation, but others do not. So that is the Treasury position set out in the minute. The meeting that took place on the 14th of November internally in the Department of Health, I say for the record that neither the inquiry nor your legal team have been able to find any minutes of that meeting. But do you think it is a reasonable assumption that such a meeting did take place, if not on the 14th of November, then around that time?
I imagine so. I've no reason not to think that. And they quote me as saying, well, we ought to do more. And I thought we should do more, but it's a characteristic of a lot of people who come new to the problem and say, we want to do more. And the more they looked at the complexity around the precedent issue, the more complex it got, because we could not accept liability if treatment is given according to the science at the time and in good faith, tragic as it is. This is the awful dilemma of this situation, but holding the ring for the broader provision of health services and health care, I had to sort of recognise the truth of that.
Now, these aren't your words, but the way that it is described is that you are said to think that the government must be seen to be doing more. Did you think that it was a matter of perception that the government should be seen to be doing more, or did you think the government actually should be doing more?
No, that's not, I mean, that is most unlikely to be me. I'm being seen to be doing the right thing isn't my sort of primary motive in life. I want to do the right thing. Now, I know in politics, perception is important, which is why I think I wasn't a very good politician. But I did want to do more. I did want to make progress.
The minute suggests that you were keener on doing something more than Mr. Clark was at this time. Do you think that's fair?
Well, Mr. Clark can be quite an argumentative sort of person, but his heart is much warmer than his sort of sometimes amiably pugnacious style. And he has the ability to completely change track when he's convinced. So I can't comment what he was really thinking of.
The initiative for this does seem to have come from you, with your discussion with Mr. Heppel leading to that presentation. This minute seems to be part of that as well. Do you think that you were persuading Mr. Clark at this time, but more needed to be done?
I'd like to think I was, but I think it might be presumptuous. He didn't need my persuasion, I suspect. But I did want to do more. This was, early in my term of office, we'd seen Robert Key. I was respectful of Mr. Heppel, and we needed to go further, and I just hoped it might resolve matters.
The minute is obviously a Treasury document written by a Treasury official, but it seems to be giving an account of internal discussions within the Department of Health. How would they have known about what was going on in the Department of Health?
I have no idea. A mole. No, I just don't know.
Do you have any concerns about the fact that the Treasury seem to have some intelligence on what is going on in the Department of Health?
Well, I've described how I regarded anybody in the Treasury as a sort of adversary, to be thwarted at every turn. But the truth is that in order to come to agreement on the spending programs, there had to be mutual trust and respect between departments and the Treasury. So this doesn't unduly worry me.
Is it likely then that there were some informal discussions going on between health officials and Treasury officials, sounding one another out, as it were?
I suspect, rather as people in the Macfarlane Trust and officials, without commitment, sounding each other out. But I don't speak on the basis of any knowledge, and just how it might have been at the time.
If we remember back to Mr. Dobson's minute, he gives his view that the Treasury is likely to resist any further funding, which presumably he would have needed his own source of intelligence to come to that position.
Well, in order to get anywhere, you have to soften the Treasury up, be persistent, be determined. And later, you see William Walgrave being absolutely brilliant with what he has secured. So it's an art form of getting the Treasury to change their mind.
I'll move on from this document. You set out in your statement, and I'm not going to go through all of these documents, we picked many of them up with Mr. Clark, and they're all set out for everybody to see there if they wish to. The statement, of course, is available online. It seems that internal discussions took place later in November. The lead seems by now to be coming from the Secretary of State's private office rather than your private office. Then Mr. Clark sent a letter to the Prime Minister on the 17th of November 1989 proposing an additional £20 million being made available to the Macfarlane Trust. Mr. Clark then met with the Prime Minister and the Attorney General, Sir Patrick Mayhew, on the 17th of November. And as I understand it, you weren't present at that meeting.
I wasn't present. Then
Mr. Clark announced the policy via a written parliamentary answer on the 23rd of November 1989. And the policy was for, at that stage, an additional £19 million to go to the Macfarlane Trust to allow for a lump sum payment to all infected people with haemophilia of £20,000 that year. And then the Trust continuing to offer means-tested help to everybody on what was described as a more generous scale. That's at 4.23 in your statement. It would seem then that as the policy developed during November, your role in it became more limited, and indeed you weren't at the meeting. Was there any reason for that?
No, I think the Secretary of State, Ken Clarke, had decided something needed to happen, and he was the one to sort this out with the Prime Minister and with the Treasury. It was a Secretary of State role, which he, of course, did excellently. I think there were also discussions which I hadn't appreciated at the time, but I appreciate more now, that the Macfarlane Trust having a needs assessment was unsatisfactory to a lot of the people involved, infected and affected, and they wanted to have a lump sum payment, which of course is complex in itself. And initially I talked about £10,000 and it came up to £20,000. These were all discussions underway, and I'm sort of delighted at the end of it all. The Secretary of State delivered what was a step change, but as we know, still wasn't sufficient.
You described it as a Secretary of State role. Is that because you needed the top person, as it were, from the department to go into battle with the Prime Minister, the Treasury and the Attorney General?
Yeah, the Prime Minister wouldn't be very interested in a junior minister. So you have to bring out the heavy guns on a policy change or a big move. And I was still new. I'd only been there a month. And I was absolutely immersed in the hospital and community care bill and, appointments and disappointments, all my other responsibilities. Whereas, Ken Clarke had been there some time and he absolutely knew where the levers of power were. And his private secretary, a very good man, Andy McKeon, would have had close relationships, with the people in the Treasury and at Number 10. So as soon as you get to the Secretary of State level, there's a sort of higher level of dialogue between the private offices.
Turning to your witness statement, perhaps we could have this on screen, WITN 5289301, page 32, paragraph 4.21. Thank you, Lawrence. The top paragraph. At the time, this is what you said in your statement, at the time, I think I was satisfied with Mr. Clark's proposals and felt that they were seeking to meet our aims as set out in Mr. Heppel's submission of the 7th of November. But it was intensely difficult. It was unlikely that any amount we could realistically offer would be seen as enough by those infected and their families. Mr. Clark's proposals nevertheless represented a significant increase in the Macfarlane Trust funding that would benefit those affected, whilst also not amounting to financial compensation, therefore avoiding any implication of perceived government/NHS liability. Now, if we think back to those three aspirations for the policy, the first one was to meet the aspirations of the Haemophilia Society so that they were prepared to recommend that their members didn't proceed with legal action. Given the disparity between what the plaintiff's solicitors were putting forward as a settlement figure and the amount that was being offered by the government, as it were, at this time, that was unlikely to be met, wasn't it?
I can't give an opinion on that because as we look through the discussion, at various times, different figures are given by the plaintiffs, by others, by the department. And so I agree that it might have been over-hopeful thinking that that would encourage the Haemophilia Society to discourage individuals from going forward with their litigation. But I hope there might be a prospect of it.
The second aspiration was that the figure would be accepted by the public and, if possible, the campaigners. We can't second guess what the public are going to consider to be acceptable, but you knew that it was unlikely to be accepted by campaigners, didn't you?
Well, I think when the announcement was made, I think Robert Key and others did welcome it. And therefore, there was a real sense that progress had been made. Extraordinarily, the other day, I might be jumping ahead, I bumped into Sir John Hannam, who was one of the people at the meeting with the Prime Minister. And I know I'm not to discuss my evidence with anybody, but he approached me and said how excited they'd all been at that moment that the extra money was coming through. So I think there were some who felt this was the breakthrough. It was unprecedented to provide these sorts of figures. So no doubt there were different expectations in different people's minds. But when Mrs. Thatcher says it should be heralded as a victory, I think that's going too far. But I think a breakthrough is what many did regard it as at the time.
The third aim was to avoid setting the precedent. Do you think that aim was achieved?
Do I think?
That aim was achieved.
I think that aim was achieved. I mean, there was always a danger that whatever happened, it could be regarded as a precedent. But we were constantly looking at legal advice, and Patrick Mayhew, I remember the Attorney General, I mean, this is from reading the papers, said that the 20 million would not be regarded as compromising our position on no-fault compensation. So that was reassuring.
Of those three aims, which was the most significant in your mind at that time?
I wanted to do more. So it's a combination, really. I would like the Haemophilia Society to have recommended that their members did not proceed, but I really wanted to do more for the infected and affected. I don't know whether the campaigners are automatically the infected and affected, or the campaigners involves a wider group.
I can't interpret Mr. Heppel's minute from that time, but I take the point. Two further questions on this and on the sum that was offered. Was it the case that the 15 to 20 million pounds was in effect the smallest amount that the government could get away with offering, given the political climate of the time?
I'm sure the hope was to do the best we could to make it a substantial and a significant amount. I mean, there was a time when the Treasury was talking about 5 million. So that, to me, would have been inadequate, paltry for the circumstances. It had been 10 million originally when Tony Newton set up the Macfarlane Trust. So to treble that seemed to me a good step forward.
The amount that was being spoken about then was about the lump sum payment was £20,000 in 1989.
90 million.
How significant would that sum have been for example, a family of 4?
It was not full compensation. It would not allow money worries never to cross their home again. But at that time, it was a significant and a substantial amount of money, a useful amount of money.
But it was not...
What's interesting to me is that they wanted to move from to change the balance between the assessment of needs and the lump sum. That balance was changing. I respect that.
That was a response to what the government was asked to do by the Haemophilia Society and others.
I think so.
Yes. There was no anticipation that this money was going to provide financial independence for people.
No suggestion of that at all. That it was always recognised that, particularly in the UK, where healthcare is free to all at the point of use, which I've said before, but it is extremely unusual anywhere in the world for people to have that comprehensive availability of healthcare. That social services and voluntary organisations were being funded to make a contribution, and then of course social security payments for people who need income assistance. So there were other mechanisms, and it was, I think, never anticipated that the individuals could avoid altogether drawing on some of the other agencies.
They would therefore continue to be reliant upon social security payments.
Well, depending on their circumstances. But the significant point later is actually saying that social security payments will not take into account the haemophilia allocation. I mean, that's quite something.
But that's the disregard in terms of an assessment. So the £20,000 that they were receiving from the Macfarlane Trust would not be taken into account when assessing means-tested benefits. Let's move on then to how the money was to be found. I won't go through all of the detail. Paragraphs 4.32 to 4.38 of your statement deals with some of it. And what you say later in your statement, at paragraph 6.13, is that the net effect was that the Department of Health were required to find £7 million in savings in the next financial year. In part, that was because the lump sum element had increased from £10,000 to £20,000. The reality of that situation for the Department of Health was that meant cutting services elsewhere. Is that right?
It was. And you see some of the discussion. Should it be the disablement services? Should it be the special hospitals that need to develop Broadmoor? It's just the range of responsibilities we had. And then the Secretary of State said I was to take 2 million out of the AIDS budget, to which I was not at all happy with that. And in the end, it was changed to 1 million from the Health Education Authority budget. The inquiry has heard from other colleagues about how important the AIDS spending was and saving life, preventing HIV AIDS spread, but that seemed to be the least bad place to take it from, and it was half what I'd been threatened with. Let's
turn to the minute which sets out the final figures. DHSC 302536_014. You refer to this at page 101, paragraph 6.18 of your statement.
Yeah.
This is from Mr. McCune, who you discussed earlier, the Private Secretary to the Secretary of State, to Ms. Stewart of the Finance branch of the Department of Health. It follows, as you've said, an internal debate within the Department of Health where you fought your corner for the AIDS budget, and various other discussions took place. But, the money, eventually, the Secretary of State was in charge of deciding what the outcome of that debate would be, and it was Mr. Clark at the time. The minute records, he now considers that the £7 million should be found by, and if we could go down, please, £2 million underspend on other CFS budgets. So that's the fact that centrally funded services within the Department of Health had underspent by £2 million, so they can use that money without cutting anything. £5 million left. £1 million from the territorial department's contributions, so that's getting the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland offices to chip in. £4 million left. £1 million from the HEA, that's the Health Education Authority allocation for AIDS. That's what you were just discussing.
Discussing that.
There had been a proposal that that'd be £2 million, but you had fought it down for £1 million. The consequence of that is less spending on education about AIDS at a time when AIDS was thought to be inevitably a fatal disease.
Correct. So it was really, robbing Peter to pay Paul.
£1 million from the DSA's additional allocation.
Disability Service Authority.
The Disability Services Authority, I think. There is an earlier paper referred to at paragraph 6.14 of your statement. I won't bring it up. But in that paper, it says that if £500,000 were taken from the DSA funding, and I quote, the authority might still be able to make progress on indoor/outdoor wheelchairs with a cut of this size.
Exactly.
And that was £500,000. The cut was actually £1 million. Do you know how that affected the programme of providing indoor and outdoor wheelchairs?
I don't know what happened. I think we got there in the end. But these are painful decisions. Very painful decisions all the time, and it's the nature of being a health minister that there are so many areas that need spending that you want to spend, and you have to make difficult choices.
The next item is £1 million from FPC administration. That's the Family Practitioners Committee. Yeah. Are you able to explain what that involved?
No, I don't. I think this was the time when we were beginning to move towards GP fund holding, and there was quite a lot of work trying to persuade GPs to be more aware of the cost of their prescribing. So a GP would write a prescription regardless of the cost. So there was no real emphasis on cost effectiveness in prescribing, and they were beginning to move towards limited lists. But this might be complete fantasy, and they might have been talking about bringing in health district nurses and counsellors. I don't know. But I think our family practitioner service has always been a hallmark of the NHS, and like everything else, it needs administration. There's always public are always very harsh about administration. They thank the doctor, they thank the nurse, they never thank the administrators, the managers, the leaders, but actually they are the backbone.
Finally, £1 million from Special Hospitals Capital.
I think this is Broadmoor.
Broadmoor, the mental health facility, secure mental health facility. Those then were where the cuts came from. You say at paragraph 6.19, and I quote, this was the reality of the allocation of finite resources to deserving causes. Is that a fair summary of
It's very much a fair summary, and I think you can almost hear by the emotion in my voice 33 years later how grievous it was to make these decisions, but they were decisions that had to be made.
The alternative would have been to obtain more money from the Treasury, but that was not likely to be forthcoming. Was that the assessment at the time?
Precisely.
In addition to these £7 million set out here, is it right that a further £5 million was subsequently required? Because the original plan had been to use up the remaining £5 million from the McFarlane Trust that year, but it was found that could not be done.
No, it's written in the text as it was in long-term gifts. It wasn't in long-term gifts, it was in long-term gilts. And therefore it couldn't be used. And so, thank goodness, again, Secretary of State double-backed and sort of did a deal with the Treasury.
I think in the end that money came from money previously earmarked for hospital information and support systems. What did hospital information and support system funds cover?
At this date, I can't tell you. Information, there was a growing sort of idea that people didn't really have the faintest idea what was going on in the health service, and that we needed better data and better information. And I think these were very early days of data management in the health service, and I imagine that's what it was looking at. So in the end, you could compare different hospitals' cost effectiveness, waiting list times, and so forth. But I stand to be corrected.
Ultimately, £12 million found from parts of the departmental budget. Does the difficulty in finding that money and the tough choices that it necessitated help to explain why there was such a concern about a precedent being set amongst...
About the precedent?
About a precedent being set.
That's in part the case. Because resource was so tight. We now spend, I think, 12% of the national wealth on health. We spent 4.5% of the national wealth on health at that time, so it's a much lower amount. And you heard from John Major, the economy was in a very difficult situation, so we were constrained. The concern about no-fault compensation, I think, was much broader than that. So it was partly that it would eat up the budget, but there were more complex factors than that. For example, concerning the Committee on Safety of Medicines and the Licensing Authority, if you say that treatment or products that are produced according to the best available evidence at the time can subsequently be regarded as subject of negligence, then that is a really slippery slope. And it would have led to more restrictive prescribing, maybe worries that people wouldn't want to serve on some of these committees. There's another argument that no-fault compensation would reduce the quality of medical practice. I'm not sure about that, but some argue it. I mean, there were any number of reasons why the no-fault compensation route wasn't one that we could embark on. And of course, they'd had the Pearson Commission in '78, which it's one of those ideas, when you start, you think, this sounds very good. And the more you look at it, you realise it's fraught with difficulty. And as Graham Hart says later on, in New Zealand, where it had been introduced, it was actually paying out very low figures. So I never think people should pursue an idea, because theoretically it's going to be a much greater improvement. Just be quite sure the option you're going for is actually improvement on the status quo.
We'll come back to that Graham Hart a minute later, but to sum up what you've just said, Bevi, the financial problems of the precedent were part of it, but certainly not all of it. There were wider concerns as well.
Correct.
Let's turn then to the HIV litigation settlement. It's something that you deal with at paragraphs 4.49 to 4.61 of your statement at page 41 onwards. I'm not going to go through all of the matters set out there. You deal in your statement with a number of submissions and decisions taken on the approach to the litigation, points about the duty of care and limitation. All of that's set out in the papers. I don't intend to go through it again. I want to pick it up at paragraph 4.61, which is when Mr. Justice Ognall intervened on the 26th of June 1990 in the case, urging all of the parties concerned to give, and I quote, anxious consideration to the prospect of any compromise of these proceedings. And that's an intervention that we've heard evidence about elsewhere. Paragraph 4.62 of your statement, you refer to the CMO's minute to you and to Mr. Clark, expressing his hope that for humanitarian reasons the government would find a way to make an ex gratia settlement in respect of what he described as a unique tragedy. At that time, the CMO was Sir Donald Aitchison. Was it common for Sir Donald, or indeed for any CMO, to intervene in a decision concerning the legal position of the department and questions of policy and resources in this way?
I'm not sure, but it was certainly a cry from the heart from Sir Ronald Atchison, and particularly when HIV/AIDS had been the subject on which he had most distinguished himself in that term. He was coming towards the end of his time at the department, so I suspect he was even bolder than he might otherwise have been. But it was a very powerful letter, and Justice Ognall's words were evocative. People living under the shadow of this grievous situation. So giving anxious consideration is certainly something that we did, but not in the direction he entirely anticipated.
Let's turn to a note that was sent to ministers. We've looked at some of the papers from around this time. I don't think that the inquiry has looked at this one before. It's DHSC 304360_147. This was a note, described as a note, sent under the cover of a minute from Mr. Heppel. The minute is dated the 24th of July 1990. The inquiry has looked at that. Is there any significance to the fact that this is described as a note rather than a submission?
Not that I'm aware of.
The note was prepared by Mr. Dobson. I'm not going to go through it all, but we can see that the purpose is to invite ministers to review the government's position in the legal action involving HIV-infected haemophiliacs in light of Mr. Justice Ognall's statement, in light of advice from Council, and in light of a submission from regional directors of public health. We have looked at that document, which is at flag B. The current policy is set out at paragraph 2, in essence saying that there's a strong legal case and settling out of court would set what Mr. Dobson describes as, and I quote, a disastrous precedent. Paragraph 3 on the next page, please. There is a summary of Mr. Justice Ognall's, sorry, it's further down, a summary of Mr. Justice Ognall's intervention. Then the next page, please.
It's important at this point, a broad hint the plaintiffs will have great difficulty in winning their case, because this is one of the things I think that the Treasury felt.
This is the broad hint given by Mr. Justice Ognall that his view was that the plaintiffs will have great difficulty in winning their case, which was also the advice you were receiving from Council at that time. And you say that's something that the Treasury felt. Their position was, if we're going to win the case, why are we paying out any money?
Precisely.
If we go to the next page, please, Lawrence, we have a summary of the advice of leading counsel, Andrew Collins, as he then was, and is confirming his earlier view that we have a very good chance of a successful outcome for the great majority of cases. And then if we could go over to the next page,
and
please.
this whole point, it's the licensing authority and the Committee on the Safety of Medicines, which had really sort of got to me, as well as the wider implications, because of the importance of our Committee on Safety of Medicines and the licensing authority and the integrity of that whole process.
That was the point stressed in the evidence given by Justin Fennick, who was the junior counsel at the time. If we could go over, please, to the following page in paragraph 8. This is Andrew Collins, the summary of his advice from Mr. Dobson, and I quote, "Council nevertheless suggests that we should consider seriously the judge's proposal. His personal view is that the government would do well to make a further, quotes, political gesture to avoid the embarrassment of a legal wrangle likely to continue through the whole of 1991. He believes that this could be contrived in a way which would avoid setting any legal precedent for other groups, see below. He accepts that any kind of deal might arouse expectations that other groups could look for similar treatment if they mounted an effective public campaign linked to legal action, and that the final judgment is a political, not a legal one." In effect, then, Mr. Collins urging ministers to think carefully about this, but accepting that it is a matter of politics rather than one of law. Is that fair?
Yes, and accepts that any other kind of deal might arouse expectations that other groups could look for similar treatment if they mounted an effective campaign linked to legal action. I mean, that's the point.
So
there's no guarantee that it won't have implications and repercussions, and that's the great concern.
Should we therefore draw the distinction between the legal precedent, which Mr. Collins says can be avoided, and, as it were, a political precedent that would be introduced were such a settlement to be made?
Perhaps.
Paragraph 9 is the submission from the regional directors of public health. They were in favour of special treatment for what they described as a special case and believed that it could be ring-fenced.
Well, they're in a horrible position because of this situation of the relationship between the haemophiliacs and their doctors, who are then implicated in the litigation. I mean, that's a really uncomfortable and unhappy situation. I entirely understand why they felt so strongly about this. And it wasn't their job to be worrying about the implications for the NHS and the Department of Health as a whole. I mean, they were passionate about doing the right thing for their patients.
If we
who
go
were in a dreadful situation. I can't say it on every answer, but please believe me, I really do understand that the predicament of these individuals, I mean, this is the time when our friend was dying, the predicament of those concerned was appalling.
Was that something that was in your mind at that time?
It was in my mind throughout, but it wasn't the dominant feature. I was the Minister for Health, and my job was to do the best I could for the health service in its entirety.
In the discussion section, I won't go all of the way through it, but Mr. Dobson sets out reasons for not settling, and he says those would be consistent with some modest additional help, is the phrase that he uses, through the Macfarlane Trust. But it also gives ministers an opportunity to review the present approach and sets out various options, including a unilateral announcement of an ex gratia payment, behind-the-scenes negotiations to find a level of ex gratia payment that would mean that most of the plaintiffs dropped their case, and also raised was the possibility of a commission of inquiry to look into the question at least of compensation and possibly also of fact as well. If we turn, the costs are then set out at paragraph 16 of the minute on page 7. And then if we turn, please, to page 8 of the conclusions, and I think this is the section that you were referring to earlier in your evidence. What Mr. Dobson wrote is this: officials have found it difficult to reach a consensus view on what is a fairly unpalatable set of options. There is clearly no certainty that any of the options outlined in paragraphs 12 to 15 would be effective in ring-fencing any further special treatment for the haemophiliacs. However, the haemophiliacs have caught the public sympathy, and there are grounds for arguing that their precise circumstances, a high degree of harm which cannot be clearly linked to the negligence of any agency, are unlikely to be repeated in any other group. Ministers will need to judge whether the political costs of maintaining the present line outweigh the risks of setting an expensive precedent if some further easement is offered.
And there is an official who evidently sort of deeply minds about the work that he's doing. I just say that because I think people can easily have a cynical view about these senior civil servants, but they were really dedicated, and this is evidently something that he and his colleagues have given careful thought to.
Now, a point that Mr. Major, also Sir John Major, made yesterday is that there is a lack of emoting, for want of a better phrase, in these kind of minutes.
Exactly.
And that last sentence, ministers will need to judge whether the political costs of maintaining the present line outweigh the risks of setting an expensive precedent if some further easement is offered. There's no reference there to the human costs of maintaining the present line, which would have been acutely felt by many hundreds, over 1,000 people around the country.
And even then, you know, I wasn't so bothered about the political costs, whatever that means. I mean, the issue is I wanted to do the best we could for all those haemophiliacs who'd been affected by HIV and AIDS. But at the same time, I had to accept that my fundamental responsibility was, as the Minister for Health, looking at the entirety of the service provision and budget and the really serious precedent implications. So that was why, in the end, with a heavy heart, I came to the decisions I did.
We'll come to those in a second, but obviously you were talking about yourself there as you can. Should we also understand that the civil servants who were drafting these documents had similar concerns, to the best of your knowledge, or were they as dry as these minutes suggest?
No, on the contrary, they were human beings. And I found it, I have nothing but warm feelings about my relationship with the officials I work with, who I felt were really committed, intelligent, integrity, commitment, working all hours. You know, all of them could have got other jobs earning more. There was a real esprit de corps in the Department of Health at that time, and it was a good place to work, albeit the work involved pretty harrowing decisions.
Before we turn to your decision, we have there a frank expression that officials have found it difficult to reach a consensus view. Was that unusual?
Quite unusual for them to express it. But then before we know where we are, in comes Mr. Heppel again with his super brain and sort of clarifies the real choices.
If we turn to that minute then, which is one that the inquiry has looked at before, DHSC 0046964_003. This is the minute dated the 24th of July 1990, which, as I said earlier, was the covering minute for the note that followed. It's sent to the CMO, to your private secretary, and to the private secretary of the Secretary of State, as well as to a large number of others.
Everybody. Yeah.
We can see that Mr. Heppel says that Mr. Dobson has prepared the attached note, and he says that Mr. Dobson rightly lays out a range of possible choices. Then he says, my own view is that the choices boil down to two. First, we continue to resist firmly the present action against the government whilst being ready to consider further help through the Macfarlane Trust. Or second, seek a settlement out of court in one form or another. Ministers are very well aware of background against which the court case is being heard. Very understandably, there is wide public sympathy for the plight of the families concerned, recognising the difficulties they already face as haemophiliacs and the prospect of infection being passed from one member of a family to another. There is, moreover, the continuing difficulty in the relationship between families concerned and their medical advisors while the case is unresolved.
I was referring to a moment ago.
And there is the cost of the case and the pressure which it brings to bear on all concerned. Over to paragraph 4, please.
And that is an official writing with empathy as well as intellect. I mean, the idea that these are faceless bureaucrats who weren't aware of the implications, it would not be justified.
Notwithstanding this background, the reasons why the government has been reluctant to concede the case or settle out of court remain valid. Indeed, the note by Mr. Justice Ognall strengthens rather than weakens this view. In the 6th paragraph on page 1, it appears to contemplate a higher duty of care for the NHS provision of medical services than that applying to any other provider, and also a readiness to accept responsibility outside normal legal liability. This tends to underline the fact that any settlement, however presented, would be a precedent, if not legal, then political, for NHS liability for any harm caused by the medical treatment, even though that treatment was given on the basis of the best available knowledge and skills at the time. Ministers will wish to read carefully through Mr. Dobson's note and the proposals in it, but my recommendation is against going down the route mapped out by Mr. Justice Ognall. At the same time, in recognition of the very special circumstances of the haemophiliac families, further payments under the Macfarlane Trust would be very welcome and help to make the government's position look less hard-nosed and unyielding. Finding the money to do this would not, of course, be easy. So that's Mr. Heppell's note. Before we turn to your response, just in terms of process, the way that these decisions are being presented to you as ministers, is there anything within that process that you find surprising or disturbing, or is it what you would have expected?
I think this is a really thoughtful note which addresses the key issues, and as set out in paragraph 4, I found it persuasive. It's so much easier when you can make a decision for which you will be celebrated, that is popular. This was never going to be popular, but it was principled, and it was necessary if we wanted to maintain the ability of the NHS to make progress in a cost-effective manner. Cost-effective sounds the wrong word, it's inappropriate, but we had to focus the budget on patient development, patient care, health innovation.
Did you find it an easy issue to navigate at the time?
Certainly not, because there was such an emotional response, and understandably, for the infected and affected. But there are many times as a minister you have to make difficult decisions which are not necessarily popular. And this is what I supported in this particular occasion.
Your response is at DHSC 0046964_008, dated the 27th of July 1990, and it refers not just to Mr. Heppell's document that we've just looked at, but also to the CMO's minutes. So that is something that was in your mind, presumably, at the time when you responded. And the comment is this: Minister of State Health has commented that she thinks we should maintain our present position. Once we move towards conceding on cases like these, it will have inevitable long-term implications for the department.
Correct, for all the reasons I've set out, and not only in terms of the budget, but also really the CSM and the licensing authority. I think I also knew what the Secretary of State thought.
It would be, as we heard in the evidence of Mr. Clark, he too was opposed to taking any steps to meet Mr. Justice Ogden's proposal, and instead wished to continue to fight for litigation. A final question on this before lunch. The concern about conceding on cases like these, a concession had already been made to people who had been infected with HIV who had haemophilia in the form of the Macfarlane Trust. That point of principle had been conceded, as it were. Was there not an argument that having been done, a higher payment through the Macfarlane Trust at that time would have been an appropriate way of meeting the concerns that have been expressed in those briefing papers without conceding any form of legal precedent?
Well, we were acting on legal advice, I assume. And the interesting thing is that although we didn't pursue the option that Lord Justice Ognall had suggested, in fact, by November, we have reached a resolution. So, once again, I think it's a little bit less black and white than the papers would suggest, because I don't believe that the new Secretary of State could come in on the 2nd of November, and on the 9th of November, the whole thing is done and dusted. So, from how I look at it with hindsight, without any documentary evidence at all, is that this was a clear view that we cannot settle, at those sorts of rates. But funnily enough, conversations carry on, and by November, we're talking about £42 million.
We'll turn to the settlement of the litigation after lunch. But just to conclude on this point, we have seen in the papers that the judge in the case was in favour of some form of settlement. Council had given a steer that the government should seriously consider settlement. The CMO and the regional directors of public health were in favour of a settlement. Officials have found it difficult to reach a consensus. And then you have Mr. Heppel advising against it, and you and the Secretary of State deciding against a settlement. Is there a significance to the fact that the medics and the lawyers are pushing towards a settlement? It's the senior civil servants and the ministers who are holding out against it.
Can you show me the legal advice again?
Yes.
Not Mr. Justice Ogden, but I thought the note from the council.
If we bring up.
I understand why the medics would be where they were. It wasn't their job to secure the budget and look across the generality of provision. I mean, I haven't really talked about this, but my passion was about doing more for mental health. And the mental health budgets were lamentable. And I desperately wanted to invest more there. So it's always a balance. But sorry, to take your point.
DHSC 304360_147. Thanks, Lawrence. On page 3 of the document.
Council's advice, right?
Council's advice, paragraph 6, which is to the effect that there is a good chance of a successful outcome in law, and that if we successfully defend this case, it should discourage further litigation. He goes on to say that in his experience it was unique for the judge to intervene in this way. Go over then to paragraph 8.
Yeah, and then there's a little about disqualifying
Despite that, the discussion about recusal, which I won't trouble you with. But then paragraph 8, despite that legal analysis, he nevertheless suggests that we should consider seriously the judge's proposal.
Yeah, okay. But then he says, except that any kind of deal might arise, except that other groups could look for similar treatment to the amount of an effective public campaign. So I think he is trying to have it both ways.
So,
this was a really difficult decision and done with great care and thought, but one we felt we needed to make.
So I'm going to move on after lunch to the settlement of the HIV litigation and then to some other issues.
Yes, very well. We'll take a break now till 10 past 2. 10 past 2.